Hello, everyone, and welcome to the conversation. My name is Yolanda Trotman, and I am your host for this evening. Listen, we have been dealing with a number of very important issues as we have discussed the criminal justice system on a much deeper level through this entire series called The Indictment. And as I've said through previous episodes, this whole series has been designed to take a deeper dive into the criminal justice system and to really tackle it in a way that hasn't been done before from the standpoint of addressing issues within the criminal justice system from the perspective of dealing with it from an attorney's perspective, from judge's perspective, from law enforcement, and how do we address the issues of police reform. We talked about it from the legislative perspective, both on the state level and on the local level. This particular episode, and we started this a little bit with the last episode, segment 6, which we had 2 weeks ago, where we started to talk about what we need to do on both the state level and what we need to do on the national level. And we have a number of guests tonight, and what we want to do is do this from a panel perspective and to make sure that we have you all participating in a way that's meaningful. So that being said, make sure that you take a moment and share the broadcast. You can do that as a watch party. You can share the live feed to your social media pages, because we're going to cover a tremendous amount of content tonight, but we're also going to give you a lot of information in terms of what we can do now in order to truly affect what is happening as far as what we need to do as we transition to getting prepared for November, because we are 97 days away from Election Day. Yes, just a simple 97 days away from Election Day, and we have so much ground that we have to cover. We also will be talking about some things that are happening here on the local level that, and when I say local, for those of you tuning in from other places, I'm talking about specifically what's going in the greater Charlotte metro area here in North Carolina, but other things that are going to be expanding on the national level. So if you missed any of the previous episodes, all of the previous episodes are on our page, are on the conversation page, both on the Facebook page and on the YouTube channel. So if you're tuning in, make sure you drop a hello, drop a wave, so that we know that you're here. And of course, if you have questions, you can put your questions in the comments. We will see them, and I'll be able to hopefully address as many questions as we can. Because we have so many guests tonight, what we're going to do is focus on what's with some of them that have been on the show before. We're going to do a follow-up in terms of where we are now, what we can do now, but we also are going to talk about it from the perspective of, again, now what? We have all of this information. What can you do individually within your local communities? What can you do on the local level, on the state level, and on the national level, which transcends whatever state you live in, which transcends whatever city you live in, and of course transcends to what we need to do on the national level as we quickly approach Election Day. And we have elections that are from the top of the ballot to the bottom of the ballot that all affect us every day, from what's going on at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue to what's going on in our own personal neighborhoods. So if you have not already done so, make sure that you like, follow, and subscribe at all things at the Convo Pod Show. You can find the Facebook page at the Convo Pod Show. You can subscribe to the YouTube channel. You can just put in the conversation with Yolanda Trotman or the Convo Pod Show, and it'll pull up that way, and you can subscribe to the channel. And of course, follow us on Instagram, because we will start doing a couple of Instagram shows, which will be a little bit different as we get into September. So our series features a number of guests. And again, for those of you that are just tuning in, make sure that you drop your questions in the comments. Make sure you drop in the hello so that we know that we see you. Hey, Beverly. Hey, Reggie. Hey, Maurice. Make sure that you drop some questions in there for us, for our guests. So our first guest that will be up tonight, we actually have a couple of things that we want to focus on, because what's been very interesting in this pandemic age that we're in is how courtrooms across the country are actually functioning. And so what we've had happen as far as Mecklenburg County and across the state is having to deal with smaller court functions. More specifically, we haven't had jury trials since March. Now, as far as federal courts have started to do jury trials, but at least on the state level, we haven't had any jury trials, which frankly is the cornerstone of what we do, regardless of whether you're a prosecutor or a defense attorney in our criminal justice system. So our first guest one of my favorite people who I've known for years, but has a very unique experience because he's been both a prosecutor and he's now a defense attorney, and not just a prosecutor that just did misdemeanor cases. He was doing homicide cases up until the time he decided to leave the DA's office and go into private practice. So welcome to the conversation, Mr. Attorney Rob Corbett. Hello, sir. How are you, my dear?
I'm fine. How are you?
Say again.
I said,
I'm fantastic. So okay. Thank you for joining us again. Yeah, I can hear you fine. So thank you for joining us again. You and Renee, who will be joining us shortly, were the first two guests in this series where we were talking about the justice system in general and specifically implicit bias. And so for those of you who are just joining us, if you missed that episode, you can go back to the Conversation Facebook page or YouTube channel. You can catch all of the replays of all the previous episodes that we've had before. So Rob, now, when we talked the last time, this was really at the very beginning of what happened with the murder of George Floyd. The officers had just been arrested, if I recall, either that day, or at least Chauvin had been arrested. The other officers had not been arrested that day. So we had a lot of ground to cover. So I want to first talk about where we are now as far as what's going on with his case and what your perception is in terms of how do you think this is going to play out from a prosecutor's perspective based on what he was indicted for. I know that's a lot.
Yeah. I think, Kurt, what you're saying in terms of, I think Chauvin had just been charged like right before we spoke the last time.
Right.
And in terms of any changes that have occurred, it's a process when you're charged with something that serious. So those cases don't get resolved quickly. It takes a time for it to work its way through the system. The only new term that I'm aware of at this point is that one of the officers who was charged with aiding and abetting second-degree murder, I think, has just recently filed a motion to dismiss. Mm-hmm. Now, in terms of, experience of how that, could occur or how that would transpire locally, it's not something that would probably, I wouldn't expect that to be heard anytime soon. And that it would probably, have to work its way through the, the regular process. And maybe once that case, or if it reached a trial stage, then you could hear, judge could hear like the motion at that time. Mm-hmm. Ask about how this could play out or what I would see from a prosecutor's viewpoint. I would think in terms of even you're dealing with the Attorney General's office who took the case. And I think like issues that would come up in terms of prosecutor we have to face or issues that could come up from the defense would be change of venue. And then when you say change of venue of when a particular case has just gotten so much publicity that the defense doesn't feel they could get a fair trial in that particular county. But this has gotten international attention. I don't know where you could go of where you have a jury pool that would say that they are not familiar with this case. I see it. Another issue I was kind of like thinking about is when you're dealing with the local population of people in that community and how they would feel or view an outside prosecutor coming in and handling a case that their own district or elected district attorney would handle. But this one, I think, was so egregious beyond the pale that I don't think that would be as much of an issue as I would be concerned about in some other cases.
And so do you think strategically, and I know neither one of us have a crystal ball, that strategically it makes sense for them to even attempt to do that in this case, given the high profile case that it is?
In terms of moving it from another county?
Mm-hmm.
I'd have to, if I was the defense attorney, I would definitely consider it. And I don't know in terms of the surrounding counties and the diversity in those counties or the population in those counties. But I definitely would consider it because even though, like we said, that you're not going to go anywhere where they wouldn't be familiar with this case, but you may think of just in terms of being in that epicenter, things are just too hot. And I would want to probably get away from that. I mean, least, just a little bit in terms of people who don't feel that how their community directly has been affected by this.
Right. And so let's talk about just briefly about what's going on with Breonna Taylor's case. So much frustration, both in Louisville and beyond. And while there was some, and I don't know if it was symbolic or not. I mean, it obviously affects people in terms of dealing, at least locally, with no-knock warrants. We still have three officers, the three officers that at least have been identified that still have not been charged. Do you see that from a prosecutorial perspective as more of a delay in investigation, or perhaps some difficulty given the fact that it was a no-knock warrant and what the circumstances were behind the shooting itself, ultimately her murder?
Yeah, I'd be hard pressed to believe that they don't know at this point what they want to do or what they need to do. And that's always the frustration of where if it's our clients, it's, whether it's true or not, it appears that when it's our clients, it's arrest first, and then we can do any subsequent investigation after that. Right. We got enough to charge, and let's just go ahead and do that. In this case, I think in terms of there's a obligation on that attorney general to say something in terms of where we are. To me, I would think there's an obligation to say something where we are. These are our initial findings, or these are the concerns that we have about this. To be fair, like we talk about, it is a no-knock warrant, which is frowned upon, but was allowed. Mm-hmm. They were going there to execute a search warrant because of information that they had, but that information was a month old.
Right.
When they breached the door, there's discrepancy as to whether they announced who they were. I can't recall, unfortunately, Miss Taylor's boyfriend's name at the time, but he reacted as any one of us would act in that situation. And whether it's licensed gun carrier or not, which he was, but he reacted in order to protect himself, Miss Taylor, and family home, and fired first. So I understand in terms of complications that may pose or I can understand complications that may pose from a law enforcement viewpoint or a prosecutor's viewpoint. But I think that still doesn't explain to me in terms of the delay of at least making some type of decision and laying that out as to why we came to this decision.
And what
leaving it out there or just hanging out there.
Right. And so do you think the delay hurts the case from a prosecutorial standpoint, especially given the fact that there's no body cam footage, which is troubling enough as it is? But do you think that even if let's say they decided to arrest them tomorrow, do you think that delay from the perspective of a prosecutor hurts the case because there's been such a delay?
No, I don't think the delay would hurt the prosecution. I see it more in terms of the delay is setting everyone up for the okie doke or shenanigans. You like shenanigans, I like okie doke.
I love shenanigans.
Yeah. But it's setting it up for that to then show in terms of, okay, this is why we're not doing anything. And the longer you wait, I think the more that builds as to, okay, this is the inevitability, this is what's coming.
So one thing we haven't talked about, and for those of you who are just joining us, make sure if you have questions, make sure you drop them in the comments because we can see them. If you just joined the watch party, send us a wave. You can also drop your questions and comments there. I'll see them. We'll answer as many questions as we can tonight. But the last couple questions before I bring in Attorney Little is one, and I just realized when I was prepping for this tonight, we never really talked about why the whole concept of an indictment, what the grand jury is, and how that process even begins. Because when I chose the name as it being an indictment on the system, meaning, okay, here's what we have. This is what we have with the system. Here's what's good, but this is what we need to change. This is what we need to do if we're going to change it. In North Carolina, in all states, we have a grand jury system that allows cases to go forward. And what oftentimes people don't know is how that process works. And so in the news, they'll hear so-and-so was indicted for something. And they're like, well, that's bad. He must have, or she must have done something if it survived a grand jury indictment. But that's not necessarily the case because the standard is so different. So for those watching, like, what does it mean? How does the grand jury process work in North Carolina? Because you were a prosecutor for so many years. And what should we take from that when we hear that a person's been indicted, at least on the state level? It's a little bit different on the federal level.
Yeah, the grand jury process is just administrative process of, in North Carolina at least, of moving a case from district court to superior court. What I tell clients is that if your case gets indicted, that does not mean that there is sufficient evidence of or proof beyond a reasonable doubt to convict. It means that they're saying that there is enough evidence to charge, which is a threshold. That means that there is some evidence, or it is likely that you may have committed this crime. And when you see stuff in the news of where they say, or the prosecutor will go, we'll leave it up to the grand jury, we'll leave it up to the grand jury, or if the grand jury doesn't return a true bill, meaning that they did not return an indictment. If a prosecutor wants a case indicted, it gets indicted. There's a saying.
Can you say that again?
Yeah. If a prosecutor wants a case indicted, it gets indicted. I remember in terms of, even times when I worked at the DA's office, that cases would be on the list to go to the grand jury. And sometimes there is a mix up in the subpoena of which officer is supposed to be at the grand jury to testify about this particular case. So if somebody didn't show up, or if the officer showed up, or it didn't have information on case C, but had information on case A and B, then case C wouldn't be indicted. Does that mean, or did that mean that case got dismissed? No, it just meant at the next time the grand jury met, they would just resubmit the case. So the saying is, if you want a ham sandwich to get indicted, you can do that. So I always say that's a cop out when you see on TV or a prosecutor says that we can't indict, or the grand jury didn't return this indictment, so we're done with it. If they want it indicted, it will, because they are only presenting the evidence that they want to present, and it's from their viewpoint. They go in and say, John Doe committed this crime. He fired the gun, shot the person, and this was a robbery that's gone bad. And the grand jury says, okay, true bill. That's what happened. They're not presenting any counter evidence or anything along those lines necessarily.
And obviously it's not obvious because people may not know this. They meet in secret. Defense attorney's not present. Defendant's not present. Nobody's present other than whoever the state chooses to call. Is that correct?
Right. That's it's a secret process. We don't even know who is on the grand jury. And some counties outside of Charlotte, grand jury will meet once a month. In Charlotte, we have 2 grand juries, and they alternate Mondays, so that cases are getting indicted every Monday. When COVID first hit, our grand juries across the state didn't meet for a few months, and they are just now ramping back up. Like for Charlotte, they started, I guess, about a month ago. I have like other cases of some other counties, and they're just now really like getting going again.
And so you just recently had a jury trial in federal court, which want to talk about that briefly, because we're in the age of COVID. People had to wear masks, I'm guessing, the entire time. What was it like from the process? Well, we also need to be very clear that it's very different when you're trying a case in federal court versus trying a case in state court, from depending on what the judge wants as far as how the jurors are selected, the number of passes, or the number of strikes that you have, how that process works, that type of thing. But I would just want to focus on like the fundamental things that you saw that were different. Yeah. How did the mask requirement affect the jury selection process, in your opinion?
Yeah. Now, the basic aspects of the trial went as normal, or like you would expect in any other trial. Concessions were made in terms of where everybody was sitting. And the jury was no longer sitting in the jury box. They're sitting in the gallery, which is the benches when you first come in. But when you say in terms of how jury selection was affected, in federal court, you already get less time to talk to them. The judge asks most of the questions, and the judge will tell you, this is how much time you have to ask questions of jurors. And everyone wore a mask. Every once in a while, a juror may have removed their mask, but for the most part, everyone stayed masked up the entire time. And you don't realize, or at least I didn't realize, or was thinking about it, how much we rely on facial cues. For instance, talking to you, if I'm saying something and I say, okay, that didn't make sense what I said, I got to rephrase it or a little bit, or it makes sense in my head, but it didn't come out right while I was talking. And with the jury being masked, you don't have that. There are certain concepts that we are looking for or asking about as the defense to make sure that our client gets a fair trial. And when you're talking to people and you see their faces, even if you don't even if they don't say anything, people kind of like tilt their head or scrunch up their face. I kind of know, all right, look, I see you might be thinking about this.
Right.
Can we talk a little bit further? Can you tell me what you think? And that affects, though, I think both sides, prosecution and the defense. But I was talking while I was in trial, an elected DA from another county had called me, and I was telling him, look, I'm in trial. I can't really deal with this case, but I told him what it was about. And he said, you might as well just put up a sheet or a wall in front of the jury if it's going to be like that, because that's how effective it is for everybody. We could have just been in there by ourselves and the jury could have been watching us on closed circuit TV.
Right.
If it was going to, for it to be like that. But that's the tug and pull that we may have to do in, at least for the foreseeable future, in that you have a right to trial. People can't stay in custody in the DA's office or prosecutor's office, not do anything. And it's like, how do we balance in terms of moving that forward, but it's still also with the aspect of you're getting a fair trial and this isn't just for show. People like coming in. Now, I will say, though, if I can add, for the witnesses, the judge did instruct the witnesses to remove their mask prior to them testifying. And I don't think they do that. So they all came in masked, and then the judge said, okay, well, you have to take your mask off. So at least that way, the jury is able to look at the witness and gauge their credibility, which is absolutely 100% important.
Excellent. So, Rob, I'm gonna have you stand by for a few minutes while Renee comes on, and then I'm gonna have you come back briefly. So, stand by for a second, and we'll talk in just a second. So, because we still have some more ground to cover for sure. So, for those of you just joining us, make sure that, again, if you have questions, drop us some questions. Beverly, I saw your question earlier, and we had actually Rob had actually answered it as far and said basically what I think you were thinking, that it would be difficult to change, particularly George Floyd's case, to another venue because it's a worldwide case. It would just be more of a strategic decision on the part of the prosecution to be able to do that. So I hope that answers your question. So next up, and for everyone else that, like I said, if you're just joining or if you're catching the replay, again, you can drop your questions in the comments, or if you're watching on the watch party, you can drop your questions and comments there. I see you, Curtis, Harry, Beverly, Darren, Vanessa. Thank you, Miss Betty. Thank you guys for joining us. So next up is Renee Little, who is a very, very, very dear friend of mine, but I'm also so excited to have her back on the show because she is going to be newly elected as your next district court judge. She has no opposition. She is a very good friend, been an attorney for quite a bit of time. If you missed her on the first episode, we were talking about the Ahmaud Arbery case, and she had a very unique perspective because she practiced in Georgia before coming to North Carolina. But more importantly, she does a lot of work with Race Matters for Juvenile Justice, which is an organization here that has been dedicated for years to addressing the issues of implicit bias, initially in the juvenile justice system, and of course, brought more broadly through a number of initiatives that they have. So wanted to talk again tonight briefly about implicit bias, because I'm not sure if you caught the special that was done on CNN over the weekend. If not, I'm pretty sure it's available for replay. It was phenomenal, and it talked about implicit bias on multiple levels. But Renee has been doing this work for so long. Definitely had to have her back on the show. So welcome once again, Attorney Renee Little. Hey, sis, how you feeling?
I'm feeling good. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am, I can. Excellent,
Good.
excellent.
Good.
So the last time you were on the show, you were talking about, we just didn't have a lot of time because there was so much ground to cover with all of the cases, and we were talking about it from the legal perspective. What I want to talk about is more specifically implicit bias in terms of One, what it means, and
Okay.
two, how is it permeating the system on a broader basis that we didn't get to touch on before, and why that's important.
Yeah, so implicit bias is basically stereotypes, attitudes that impact your judgment, your decision making, your actions unconsciously. You don't even realize it's there. It's that innate thing in us that reacts to something without us knowing about it. And it's not inherently bad. Let's start with that. It could be shown in preference. It is tied to science that our brains are wired to move and act, and that's a good thing when it keeps us safe. So when you get in your car, I always call you Judge Yolanda, Miss Trotman. When you get in your car and you drive, you're not thinking, how is my heart beating? Do I turn the key a certain way? Which street do I live on? You're just moving because our brains are wired to just process and go. And so implicit bias can be a good thing. You see a shark in the water, hopefully you're gonna run. So you're not gonna stop and think, oh, a shark, its teeth. Our bodies are really, our minds, our brains are wired to just really move forward and think. And so we categorize things. We try to be safe, right?
Mm-hmm.
The problem with implicit bias is that if we're not mindful of it, we can have preference and we can have prejudice. We
Mm-hmm.
can have ways we see people before we know who they are, know what they do. And a very great friend and mentor of mine always says, the way you see people is how you serve them. So if you're not mindful of the implicit biases, the prejudices you have, especially along the lines of race or gender or orientation or age or even ability, you end up really demeaning people and not affirming their humanity. And in the case of the legal system, often doing a lot of harm.
And so now when they started doing, and I'm going to have Vicky Foster talk about this too, but there was a push to have implicit bias training with CMPD and with other law enforcement organizations.
Yeah.
But was there ever any follow-up? Was there data that supported it after the fact, or was it the 2-day session and that was it? Well, how did it work
Sure,
back then?
sure. Well, I'm going to let the chief speak specifically to how their system processed the data. I will say this: CMPD was incredibly committed, along with CMS, along with the guardian ad litem's office, the clerk's office, key leaders in this community, and getting their staff there. So DSS has social workers from Child Protective Services in these trainings, the 2-day racial equity workshop. CMS had their principals, their frontline teachers. And so I saw that commitment consistently with CMPD. We have a liaison with CMPD, would make sure that we would always have a steady flow of officers. But one of the things that we're really clear about in Race Matters is that we deal with our own ground. So we bring these partners together to call in, not call out. So that means even though we share data, we let CMPD deal with CMPD when it comes to what is the impact this is having on our officers. Now, there is a pretest. Dr. Susan McCarter from UNCC, she heads up RMJJ's we call our data division, and she, along with her team, they make sure there's a pretest. Everyone that does our 2-day workshop, there is a pretest before they do the workshop, and then there's a post test to see how things may have changed. So we do have that data, but when it comes to how is the needle really moving, that's something that I definitely believe CMPD officers and leaders can answer when it comes to their actual system.
So what are you seeing within the court system in terms of taking this more seriously, and especially as it relates to dealing with people who are involved in the criminal justice system, whether they are a juvenile or an adult?
A lot of great measures. So all of our juvenile judges, for the most part, have been committed to this and are around the table. So we have a number of judges that are part of the initiative. There are bench cards from national courts, the national, I'm not saying it correctly, but the National Council of State and Family Judges that they use in our dependency cases to really ask themselves some really hard questions. Because one of the ways you can really mitigate implicit bias, especially for judges or those who are decision makers, is slowing down. There are science studies from Project Implicit at Harvard and other amazing gurus in this work that say that when you're tired, like right after lunch, or at the end of the day, when you've made thousands of decisions, there is a tendency, and you know this, Judge Trotman, to sometimes not dial it in because you're serious about your job, but you have to be more cautious. You have to be more careful. You have to be mindful of heuristics, and that's used often in jury trials where people.
Now, wait a minute, Renee, you're using your big words, heuristics.
Sorry.
Please explain, ma'am.
Well, so one of the things we talk about implicit bias are there are all these categories of things that can happen. So, when someone uses a special number in a jury case, right? And they use that magic number, chances are a jury is going to come back with that same number when it comes to damages. So there are things that if we're not careful, our minds can play into. So, judges, if a DA is saying a magic number, 5 years, as far as giving someone probation, if you're not careful, it's real easy to lean into whatever that number is. So judges and decision makers have to make sure they're really mindful about where they are. They're mindful about what am I thinking about as I make decisions. So when it comes to the bench cards, at least with some of the juvenile court things, asking questions about what role did race play in this, right? Thinking about gender. I really appreciate the fact that a lot of our judges have accountability partners, other judges, of course, that they've asked to say, come to my courtroom anytime. Feel free to ask me why I may have made a certain decision. So I'm really proud of the work that the judges have done. I'm proud of the work the clerk's office is doing. That's why I work under the Honorable Lisa Chingari. She has trained all of her clerks, assistant, and her deputy clerks. They've gone to the 2-day workshop, and she's had a special training for them just to talk about implicit bias. She also has a diversity, equity, and inclusion council that really looks at practice change. How do we deal with race in the workplace? Right now, we are completing a 21-day journey of looking at race. The ABA, if you haven't checked it out, and I'll put the link in your chat, did an amazing 21-day journey into race. And so the Diversity and Equity Council is looking at that. We're looking at work on the ground, such as people who need their rights restored. And the fact that there are a lot of people, especially people of color, who don't realize that once they've served a felony conviction in North Carolina, they're automatically restored, but they need to go to the Board of Election and make sure they're still on the rolls, or they've served a federal conviction that you needed to come to the clerk's office where we can certify that your rights have been restored so that you can once again go to the Board of Elections. And so she is really leading the charge in educating the community about people's rights and making sure that her office truly sees people, right? So that she can serve them better.
So I'm going to leave this up here for a second. And for those of you just tuning in, I promise I'm going to pop it back up on the screen again. So Renee touched on a couple of things that are super critical as we get to the Now What segment. First, make sure, and we don't have this issue so much in North Carolina, but in other states, you got to make sure that you're properly registered where you live. So if you go to iwillvote.com, you can check your registration status. You can register to vote there. It even has your voting record. Just gonna put that out there. And you can also request your absentee ballot. It also takes you to the State Board of Elections website directly where you can request your absentee ballot, which I encourage everyone to do. Something that's also new that Senator Muhammad told us a couple weeks about, I didn't know, that you can also register to vote at the DMV website, which is at ncdot.gov, which is up here on the screen as well. So you can register to vote there, and I Will Vote will take you and show you which districts you're in, what you're in, who's your state rep, or I'm sorry, your state representative, who your state senator is, shows you all of that in one place. I think it's a little bit easier to navigate. I think also, I love the Board of Elections website, but sometimes it's not the most user-friendly to get to information. I've been to the I Will Vote site, and it really helps you out as far as that's concerned. But Renee, I'm gonna have you hold that thought for a second, because what I wanted to talk about with you and what I want to talk about with Reverend Dr. Sadler kind of piggyback with each other in terms of race itself and what we are doing now, because you're telling us what is happening as far as the court system is concerned. Want to focus with Dr. Sadler in terms of a very exciting project commission that's coming together that's dealing with the issue of race on a much deeper level and on a community level. So I'll be back. I'm gonna bring you back in just a second. Don't go anywhere. Okay. So our next guest is the Reverend Dr. Rodney Sadler. Y'all, because I'm a preacher's kid, you can't really introduce a minister without getting hyped. So but in all seriousness, Dr. Sadler, Reverend Sadler, if you known him for years, has been very active in the community, dealing across all types of issues dealing with race, certainly dealing with the faith community and being part of a number of initiatives to really be able to bring faith communities together in a real and tangible way. Very excited to be a part personally of a project that's coming together where we're going to be talking about race in a way that I don't think has been done in the Charlotte area before. And it's a model that I think ultimately we think will go on a national basis, but we obviously have to start here at home first. So welcome to the show. Hallelujah. Reverend
Thank
Dr.
you.
Rodney Sadler Jr. Hello, sir. How are you this evening?
I am blessed. I'm glad to be with you this evening.
Well, it is my pleasure to have you on the show. So for people who don't know you, give us about a good 1 minute or so synopsis on who you are and your journey to be obviously to becoming Dr. Sadler and the type of work that you're doing now.
Well, Reverend Dr. Rodney Sadler, associate professor of Bible at Union Presbyterian Seminary, and also the director of the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation. I work with a number of different groups around the state, the NAACP. I'm on the executive committee there. I work with a number of groups, the Department of Environmental Qualities, Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, and then work here locally. And the work that we're going to talk about tonight is with the Reimagine America Project, Truth, Reconciliation, and Atonement Commission, and what we're trying to do with this particular group.
And so what drew you into the ministry? Did you know at a young age that you wanted to be a part of the ministry? Was it ingrained in your family? Tell us a little bit about that journey.
Oh, wow. Getting into ministry was an odd, I didn't choose to go into ministry, was never a church person as a child, was in the church all the time, but it was not my great love per se. But I think I just heard God's call and realized that this is where I was fit to work. This is God shaped me in particular ways that led me in this direction. I guess I didn't have the musical ability to be the next Prince. I, wasn't going to go on to be a medical doctor. So this is where God led me. So,
and how long have you?
Path.
Absolutely. Now, how long have you been how long have you been a minister?
I've been a minister. I've been licensed since I think 1990, been ordained since 1993. So a few years now, about
just
27, pushing 30. Actually, yeah, I guess it is about 30 coming up this next year. So,
and so it's
been a good time.
I'm sure. And so you've transitioned into teaching now, or doing more teaching.
Yes, I actually started off with a ministry that was involved in social justice work. I worked with the Congress of National Black Churches in Washington, D.C. Worked with a number of other groups that did social justice work in D.C. before I moved down here to do my PhD at Duke. And I've been in North Carolina since, I think, 1993 now. So I think I feel like I'm an official North Carolinian, though I'm sure many people will still consider me a Yankee.
Well, we don't hear it in your voice. You got enough Southern in there. I don't hear New York. So you home.
Man.
You home now. You home now. It's all good. So let's talk about the Reimagine America project. So this started as in the wake of what happened to George Floyd and his murder. And it started with a call that we were a part of a month or so ago, just kind of talking about it in general. For people who haven't heard of it, tell us a little bit about where the idea came from, and then I'm going to bring Renee back up because we want to talk about it from a community perspective, because I see a couple of questions that I think are going to be relevant. So let's talk about just in general where the idea came from and what the vision is at this point.
Well, certainly. Thank you for that question. I think originally this idea began several years ago when the Obama administration was still in office. A group of us had developed a plan to do a national truth and reconciliation process. We called it the Truth, Reconciliation, and Anti-Poverty Commission. We actually went to the White House about 2 or 3 times to meet with their executives to talk about doing this on a national level. And unfortunately, it was near the end of their tenure, so we weren't able to continue it. And in as much as we didn't have a compatible next president, we weren't able to perpetuate the idea.
That's so nice. Can I just stop you? That was such a pleasant way of saying it. We didn't have a compatible next president. Okay, I'm sorry, because you know that's not what we really want to say. But okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm trying to listen to the Lord.
Okay.
So the idea behind this really is that we have long since talked about the fact that we need to have a conversation about race in America. But whenever this comes up, we do simple things. We deal with issues of racism. We don't deal with the root. Uh, Issues of racism. We'll talk about police brutality. We'll talk about police misconduct. Issues of race. We'll talk about schools that are failing Black and brown children. But we won't talk about the fact that the fundamental issue that we have to attend to is the ideology that says fundamentally human beings are different and that human beings can be arranged in a racial hierarchy. Those with less melanin are higher on the scale, those with more melanin are on the lower end of the scale. And what this ideology does to our overall system, how this notion of difference is fundamentally opposed to the notion that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all human beings are created equal. It is antithetical to that to have an idea of race sitting alongside it. You can't have an America where we're all equal while at the same time holding that we're all unequal. Some of us are better than, some of us are worse than. So the concepts are fundamentally incompatible, causing a schism in the American psyche, which rends our society in the ways that we see, producing great disparities. The differences that we see between Blacks and whites in so many areas are apparent but not apparent. One of the things the good things that's come out of the horrible crisis of the COVID infections in our nation, the COVID pandemic, has been we've begun to see the disparities in race around what's going on with COVID. Why is it that Black people are getting this more often than white people? Why is it that they're succumbing more often than white people? Well, in fact, it has nothing to do with their health status. We talk about diabetes and hypertension and asthma and all these things. It has to do with their fundamental economic status in the overall system. The fact that they have to more likely work in public places, in service jobs, that they don't have access to affordable health care, that many of them don't have cars, so they have to take public transportation, all of which puts them at greater risk. So the concept of race really influences that. The same thing that we see with the George Floyd uprising. The George Floyd uprising demonstrated that race has a role in the way that we deal with police officers. So policing, that illustration, I think more than anything, has galvanized the world around the fact that we've got to do something about race. So in the aftermath of the George Floyd uprising, we said it's time for us to begin to bring this idea back of a national truth and reconciliation process and to begin to say we have to deal with the fundamental issues. I told this story. I had a rose bush that I planted by my mailbox a few years ago. And I thought it'd be a pretty rose bush. Everyone would like it. The mail people, the mail carriers would come around and say, this thing is dangerous. It's pricking us when we put mail in there. So I said, I'll cut it down and thought that that would be the end of it. But later on, it grew up again. And then I cut it down again and then grew up again. Cut it down at the end of the season, grew the next season. And I began to realize I don't just have to get rid of the bush, racism. I have to get rid of the root, the concept of race itself. And the fact that we think of this as legitimate, that we give it validity, and because we give it validity, it serves to undermine our abilities to function as equals in this larger society. And not only that, it serves to excuse the fact that there are inequalities. Well, Black people, they're suffering in the ghetto. Well, we expect that for Black people. That's what race does to us. Black people are struggling with less money than white people. Well, we expect that because the concept of race has conditioned us to believe that these things are legitimate, that this is the natural order. And dare I say, just to indict my own institution, the church over the years in America has participated in the perpetuation. We brought God into this and let God become a force that reinforced this ideology. So it's time for us to begin to look at all of the systems in our society, to begin to talk about the way that they have perpetuated injustice and imbalance and begin to reform it. That's why I talk about this as the Reimagine America project, because fundamentally we need to reimagine what it is that we think about when we think about our nation. We need to reimagine it and reconstruct it from the ground up.
Absolutely. And that was a whole word. Amen to all of that. Yeah. But I want to make sure that I have time to deal with this on a bigger picture. But quickly, yes. What are the things that the commission is looking to do locally to involve the community? And what are the objectives at this point? Because we're going to have obviously a much longer show once we get ready to do the first major commission meeting or commission meeting where we're involving the community. But
Yes.
what are the main objectives that people need to know now?
Thank you. Well, the fundamental thing is that we're going to pull together a commission of community leaders. These won't be all the community leaders, but some community leaders from different groups that will serve as the commission. The commission will serve multiple roles, will be divided fundamentally into two different areas. One area is the hearings committee. The hearings committee is going to be comprised in order to listen to people's stories, to hear stories of Black and brown people who've been disenfranchised and disadvantaged in this larger system, to hear stories of white people who've recognized the role that they've played and decide that they want to move against it. We'd love to hear from people like bankers who've recognized that their lending practices have been disparate towards African Americans, that we've charged higher interest rates to Black and brown people that we charge for white people for houses and cars and things of that nature. We'd love to hear people from corporations that have recognized that their hiring policies have been problematic. We'd like to look at other groups that have recognized the role that they've played in perpetuating lack of equal employment, a lack of equal access to living wage, things of that nature. So one of the groups is want to hear from people. And this is meant to touch people's heads and people's hearts. We want to make sure that we can get people to feel what this concept of race has done. The other track is going to deal with modes of redress, i.e., what do we do now as we look at different things, as we look at education, as we look at the court system, as we look at policing, as we look at the city and the services that the city provides and the county provides. How has this impacted housing? How has this impacted healthcare? How do we begin to transform the system within? And in part, that committee, that track has less work to do in theory because there are also many wonderful studies that have already examined what's going on in Charlotte. We have a 10-year in homelessness project in the city that was done 10 years ago and put on the shelf.
And here we are. Exactly.
It's time to take those things off the shelf. Time to begin to look at the Opportunity Task Force, all that wonderful work that they did, sitting on a shelf. Time to get that back out, lift it up and say, what can we do right now? How can we invest our money, our resources in it? How do we begin to create a greater balance? How do we begin to make sure that people have access to a living wage, affordable housing, adequate health care? How do we begin to make the shifts that we need to promote greater equality in our society?
Outstanding. So I'm going to bring Renee back up because what I want to talk about is race and implicit bias briefly before I bring in Vicki Foster, because I see a question from Angela that I'm not sure if Renee can answer, but I am curious about some of the things that we can do, because a lot of our issues that we had when we originally had these conversations were dealing and circulating around police brutality and the things of that nature. So Renee, darling.
Yes,
so
ma'am.
let me so what I want to focus on while I have the two of you up is more specifically when we're talking about race and implicit bias together. What is it that we can do as a community? And Dr. Sadler, I'm going to ask you to answer this from the clergy perspective, as far as dealing with implicit bias and addressing some of these issues. And then Renee, I'm going to ask you the same question from the judicial system perspective.
Yes, ma'am.
So, I'll start with you, Renee. When we're talking about bias, one of the questions that Angie asked, and I don't know if if anyone can answer that, because I don't know the answer to this question, but you might be able to tell us whether or not this was even a discussion. But she asked specifically, why hasn't the sheriff's office done implicit bias training, or was that offered, or is that because the majority of those who are working within the sheriff's office are in fact minority or African American or people of color?
Well, let me start first by saying all people have implicit bias, all people, including Black people. So,
well, no. I think she's asking about the training. Like, did the office actually take the implicit bias training?
Sure. Well, yeah, we actually have the sheriff at the table, and they are responsible for making sure that there are members of their staff. Now, what's happened is COVID has happened, and so our trainings were on halt. But the sheriff's office is in the pipeline. We do have the sheriff at the table as one of the leaders of our MJJs.
But one of the things you were saying, which I think is an excellent point, is that we all have implicit bias, regardless of whatever our race is. Now, I had put up there earlier, and I do encourage everyone to take it, because I've done it and I tried to cheat and it didn't go well. So Harvard has a really great test, an implicit bias test, where you can do it through race, through gender, through sexual orientation, all of that. It is not what you think. I
No, it's
promise you,
not.
it's not what you think. And if you do like I did, and you think you smarter in the test, you're gonna be your feelings really gonna be hurt
Yes,
when
your
you
feelings
get.
will hurt.
Yes, your feelings will definitely be hurt once you get your results. But I definitely encourage you to go to implicit.harvard.edu to take that test within the next couple of days. It will probably surprise you, but you just follow the instructions and see what comes up. But I think when we're talking about the issue of what we can do now, Dr. Sadler, what do you think? Because churches aren't meeting. I mean, not in the classic sense anymore. So you don't have the energy of a congregation the way that you normally have. Pastors can't necessarily connect with their congregation the same way. What do you think their responsibility is now, and how can we creatively bring people together to tackle some of these issues that we're going to discuss in a few minutes, as far as police brutality and what we need to do on the local level?
So the first thing I'll say is that the first problem that the Christian church had to deal with was the problem of race. Whether or not Jews and Gentiles could sit together at the same table, whether or not they could be accepted as equal. So this is a fundamental problem that the church has already begun to deal with. And the solution was that we are, as it says in Galatians chapter 3, verse 28, we are all one in Christ, that we all are one together, that there is no division, there's no longer Jew nor Gentile, there's no longer slave nor free, there's no longer male and female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. We need to go back to that original solution as churches across the country, across the world, and recognize that there is fundamental to our Christian faith the inherent notion of oneness. And as we move beyond that, I think that the church has got to start to stand up and say, this is an issue we have to deal with. White church, black church, this is something we have to deal with. The COVID crisis presents a wonderful opportunity. Everybody's at home now, so there's no excuse why you can't have, in addition to your Sunday service and your Wednesday night Bible study, a Tuesday night session that deals with race, that allows people to begin to deal with race. You might even start off with, what does race look like within the Christian church? How has Frederick Douglass talked about it as providing a thin veneer to cover the racist activity that was involved in slavery? How did Martin Luther King Jr. talk about the church as a comfortable behind the anesthetizing security of stained glass windows, i.e., silent and not getting involved in the transformation? No, we need to wake the church up. We need to utilize the power of the church to transform the people of the church, i.e., the Christian community. The Christian community does not just exist within those four walls, as we found out during this pandemic. It exists all over the nation, all over the world. Presidents and kings and judges and whatever, everybody is part of this larger community. Everybody needs to utilize the social capital that they have to begin to transform this system. So it's time to wake up the powerful giant that is the church and get the church to be actively involved collectively when we come together. Again, Tuesday night, Thursday night, special Bible study looking at race, book studies talking about race, larger discussion groups that bring black, white, brown together to talk about the issues of race, and then begin to strategize. What are some things that we can do to use our social capital? We've got a group of lawyers at our church. How do you begin to transform the judicial system? We've got a group of teachers here. What can you begin to do to help transform the way that we teach our children to make greater equity and balance in Charlotte-Mecklenburg school system? We've got a group of people that are there who are public officials. What can you do in your role as public officials to transform the system? So I think the church is there. The church needs to be activated to utilize its resources in the mode of fostering social transformation.
So Renee, I'm gonna ask you this question. Let me ask you this question, because I think this might be, because of what I want to ask you now. You obviously, people still need to vote for you in November, but you will be a district court judge. Because Annetta commented, I saw that, Annetta. I know that's your campaign man. She said, tell them they still got to vote. Yes, they still have to vote for you.
Please vote.
But because I want you to hold that thought, Renee, because when I bring a couple of other people on, I want to focus on something else just really quickly. But when you put on if you, as a new judge, what is it that you want to see more of from more experienced judges as they tackle this issue of implicit bias? And when I say that, I remember going to things that the Institute of Government would put on, went to a race in the court session. The judges who needed to be there weren't there. And so when that happens, when it's voluntary, you don't necessarily reach the people who need to be reached. But as a new judge, what would you like to see happen within amongst your own colleagues to be able to take this more seriously? for lack of a better way of putting it?
Sure. I would like to see what I saw today. I will not say his name, but I had an opportunity to have a great conversation today with a seated judge in Superior Court, where they directly deal with criminal cases and all cases in the court system that deal with implicit bias and race. But Superior Court, you're talking about, when you talk about the power to send someone to prison and change the lives of generations, they have that power. And what was interesting is we don't have the same party affiliation. We were not of the same ethnicity or race, but we were able to have a conversation about commonality. And I think one of the things that'll be amazing for judges to do, for those who have taken RMJJ, who are part of it, those who care about racial reconciliation, to really start having some small groups. Right now at RMJJ, we have catalyzing change, where people who've taken this course get together. Dr. Sadler's a part of it, was a part of it for years, and we talk it out. People of color, as well as white allies, are now co-conspirators, those accomplices. I think judges have to have a safe place to do that amongst themselves. For those who bought into it, there's always some commonality with somebody. Reach out and start really, if not so much recruiting, talking to people, not calling folk out, calling them in. So I want to be able to reach out to people who don't believe it yet, to find out why, to have conversations, to build relationships, so that judges can, in their own groups, really unpack these issues. District court judges, superior court judges, I believe appellate judges in time, given what our Chief Justice courageously said about race a few weeks ago. So I really do believe the judicial branch has to start having private conversations where they feel safe enough to say, what don't I know? How do I build accountability? And how do I reach out across the aisle to those who may not be a part of my group to say, we care about justice. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. We can rally around that. Now let's talk about how we can together make our justice system better. So that's something I really hope to do. And I mentioned this the last time I was on your show. We've got to get this to jurors at some point. They are a part of our system. We never talk about that. We talk about judges, we talk about DAs and public defenders and social workers, but everyday amazing people who make decisions, they are part of this process. They go to churches, they are in the communities. We have to, at some point one day, be open to having implicit bias conversations with the jurors before they're impaneled.
And the problem with that is, and I think Rob would chime in too, is that we have to be very careful about, obviously, the questions that we ask, and being able to address some of those issues in a broader sense. I need you both to stand by, and I think, Renee, I think where you may have been going, I want to bring you back so we can talk in a little bit more depth for that. So, because there's two more people I want to talk to real quick, and then I want everybody on, because I've got a couple of other questions that I want to pose to the whole panel. So stand by. All right. So next, coming up is another dear friend, a legend in her field, if you will. She just recently retired from being the assistant chief of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department. She was on the show. She was segment 2 when we were talking about specifically police reform, the thin blue line, her personal experiences, particularly being in a position of leadership as a woman, more specifically as a Black woman. And we started to talk about some of the things that we can do as far as police reform. But because we're talking about this in terms of what we can do now, definitely wanted to have her back to talk about what we as individuals can do, especially in light that we have a new police chief here and other things that we need to address, especially with the burgeoning crime rate and some other things. So, of course, welcome to the show, Vicky Foster. How you doing? How are you?
I am good. I'm doing good. Hope you
I can't hear. There we go. We got your audio. How you feeling this evening?
I'm great. I'm doing good.
So I want to focus on where we left off the last time, because what you talked about, because you did a really powerful live where you were talking about some of the things that people can do now as far as addressing some of the issues, as far as addressing police training specifically. And, you know, one of the questions that was asked was about training as far as CMPD and what, if any, follow-up there was once they did the RMJJ or the implicit bias training. Was there follow-up or data or anything after that once the officers went through that training?
So let me say a couple of things. And Judge Little was very gracious in her response as to how supportive CMPD was of the training. And CMPD was very supportive of the training. But, I'm always going to keep it real.
Yes, ma'am.
I was going to keep it 100. It was a challenge for us, and some of it was people don't like to be told that they have to go to a implicit bias training. And so at that time, it was mandated. So you didn't get the cooperation from people because they didn't like being told that they had to go. So I would tell you that it was a struggle. And I know she would never speak of the struggle here, but it was definitely a struggle for us. You had all ranges of people. You had people that felt like it was just learning about implicit bias was bashing a certain race. It was bashing the Caucasian race. And so it was really, really hard for us to get people to want to go and engage. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody was like that, but it did get bad enough to where I had to send executive people before each class to say why we're here and why we're doing this and how I expect for you to conduct yourself. So, like I said, I'm going to always keep it real, and Renee will probably, would not want to say anything about that, but that's what it was. And so, unfortunately, people don't like hearing the history of policing, the history of African Americans. And so it posed a problem. And so the data, as far as that's concerned, a lot of we read the surveys. Yes, you had some people that enjoyed it and said, I learned something new. You had some people that were like, okay, well, what do I do now? Now that I know, and now that I know that I've done this, how can I help? So we had those. And then we had people that just couldn't stand it. Mm-hmm. And so, as far as doing something with the information, it was really honestly just to get them through it, to try to open their eyes to see that there is implicit bias, how it works, how it can impact you at work, how you can do it and not even know it. And so we didn't do anything, honestly, with the data. We did have people to join the Catalyze and Change that Judge Little spoke of, but there was not a lot of people that stayed engaged and involved. And so it's a lot of deep-rooted stuff inside of police departments that people just sometimes don't want to admit.
So we have a chief, African-American male.
Yes.
This is now our third African-American male chief that we've had, beginning with Chief Monroe. And I do want to say, just because we're transitioning to another topic with Vicki Foster, if you have questions specifically, again, you can drop those in the comments if you have questions, or if you're watching through the watch party, drop them in the watch party. We can address those as well. So what advice would you give him, given where we are now? And I know you're going to keep it real, because I need you to, and the people need to hear an honest answer, because we have a murder rate that's it's going in the wrong direction.
Right.
And this is still in the era of a pandemic. I fear personally that, once things don't happen the way they should, as far as giving people financial support, as far as, with the unemployment rate, this is just going to get worse. I'm sure Rob can speak to this as well. I'm gonna bring him up in just a second. As we've seen our caseloads increase. I know I've seen my caseload increase, and I don't see where it could possibly honestly get much better unless we have some real leadership to address some of these social issues that we're finding in an era where it's pretty clear there's distrust for the police department and not much being done to be able to build relationships between the police department and the community. What advice would you give him?
Well, I would have told him not to do it.
You're like, bro, it ain't got to be you, sir.
That's the real advice I would have said. But I've talked to him briefly just once, because I know he's trying to get acclimated, and of course I'm trying to distance myself a little bit from the police department. But the advice that I would give him, to be honest, and he knows this, he knows that the police department and the community, although we have worked so hard and for so many years under these last 2-3 chiefs at bridging the gap, with the community and police, it's still going to have to be more. And I think the hard part is going to be figuring out what exactly is that. what exactly can be done now? Because now, we already had distrust. And so now distrust is huge. And so now you're almost like starting back at square one. And, what he can do is, I honestly, other than having open and honest and transparent conversations and, going to the communities and having those conversations, and we cannot just be upset when people ask the hard questions. And there are some things obviously that we as a community can do better as well. Everything is not on the police, and I always say that we have some responsibility in this ourselves. And especially when it comes to crime and rising crime, and people are like, yeah, police is supposed to suppress crime. But in all honesty, police are typically in reactive mode. I mean, that's really how it works for us. One, because of, we're short almost 200 officers, which people don't realize how much that really equates to. But so that's what happens. I mean, so in all honesty, we need the community. And, we need the community to almost be their own Crime Stoppers. You got to start to talk. You got to speak. I mean, you can't, don't get me wrong. I wouldn't tell anyone to put themselves in any danger by telling, or giving information to the police. But because this lack of trust right now, so the people that were coming to us will now likely not come to us. And so it's just going to get worse. And so the community has to come together and say, okay, we're going to be the voice. When we see something, we're going to call, we're going to tell the police what we know. And I know that that's a whole big deal for people. And I understand the trust factor. But if we don't work together, this is going to get worse.
Personal question.
Yeah.
And this is from you talking, although we know how people are.
Mm-hmm.
When there was 3 nights of, I'm just gonna say shenanigans. Rob knows that's my word.
Okay.
Around Juneteenth weekend that culminated. Lord have mercy. Culminated. Y'all know what I meant. Culminated in people losing their lives. Do you think it was a mistake to let it go on the way it was? People doing donuts in the street night one, and things that normally we would never see on Beatty's Ford on any other night, but it was allowed to happen for 3 straight nights unchecked.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that was a mistake?
So let me say this, because I don't know the details around why something was not done during that time period. So normally I would know that detail and I could kind of say, but I will say this, you're at a catch-22. Now, obviously, I don't know what they knew. I don't know what the police knew. I don't know, if they knew what time something was starting, if somebody called them and said it out there and they decided, hey, we're not going, we're just going to let people do what they want to do. I don't know. But what I will tell you is they're really at a catch-22, because here's what happens. When things like what had just happened with, the riots downtown, the police tend to try to pull back, because now you have everybody saying, oh, you're here and you're doing this and we're peaceful and we're whatever. So then they try to pull back. Well, then as soon as they pull back, then you got something like this that happens. Now, granted, I don't know the details, but should someone have been out there and ensuring that wasn't happening, I will absolutely say, sure, somebody would have. If they knew, they should have been there and it should have been stopped. So that piece is easy for me. But it is a catch-22 for when you show up, people don't want you there. They only want you there when they want you there.
Right.
Yeah.
So what are the 2 things, because I want to kind of talk about this with our next guest as well, but what are the 2 things that is most important, you think, to change within CMPD policy wise that we can actually lobby for change, lobby our council members for change as far as CMPD policy? If there were 2 things that you would change, what would those 2 things be?
Well, okay. So a couple of things. One, as far as change, I will start off with the policy in reference to what happened with the riots. And that's already being worked on. So, there's a Safe Communities Committee that the city has started. I'm actually on that committee, but that the city started after this to kind of put together some of the requests on policy changes. So this group meets every other Thursday to talk about policy changes and those things. And Councilwoman, she may talk about that as well. But so one of them would be, how do you hold people accountable for when they take action that has not either been approved or it was not appropriate? And so that policy is already being looked at. And so that's one thing.
Mhm.
The other, there's so many policies. It's hard for me to say to pick two. I mean, our use of force policy has been revised so many times, and we don't allow chokeholds and things like that. So some of the common things that you would say, okay, well, yeah, these need to be changed. We don't allow that stuff anyway. So though use of force is always the one you want to look at to make sure that officers have enough latitude to do their job, but also it's not so open and so relaxed and open-ended to where things like what occurred could happen. So use of force is always the big one. But I honestly think that our policy, and I know there's some others that probably think some other things should be changed, but I think our policy is pretty tight on that.
Okay. One quick question from Jonathan before I bring up our last guest and then the full panel. He wanted to know, are there resources for officers who were not very receptive of the training? And Jonathan, I'm assuming you mean the implicit bias training. So if they weren't receptive,
Right.
were there other options in terms of training, or it was just kind of like, we got
No.
your feedback? Okay.
Right. Yeah, and a very good question. Now, mind you, we went through this training. This was Chief Moreau days. So this is around 2010 to 2012 or 13, and still going. So no, there was nothing additional. We did pay attention to the people that were very outspoken about it and the people that did not care for it. And we really wanted to understand why, because really I don't know, if you haven't attended it, you should. It's a great class, but it really talks about, how we are and where we are today and why we're there. And I think that history is very important for police officers. You have police officers that always want to know, well, how is it that a generation of people can live in public housing? And they can't understand that. And so this is the police. And so when you have a class like this, it explains to you how that happens. It explains to you very easily how it happens. And so, I personally think that we probably could have done something different. Maybe after that, we probably should have had some sessions to kind of follow up. No, we did not. And I will tell you, those things are very hard to do. It also costs. So people have to remember that. It's also time, 2 days taken out of officers taken out of service, which is very hard for us to do. But no, there wasn't anything else, and it probably needs to be. Yeah.
Okay. So I need you to stand by. I'm gonna bring you back in a few minutes after we talk to our last guest, because I want to talk to you about what we need to do about this subpoena power for the Civilian Review Board. Okay, wait a minute. Hold that thought. So for those of you just joining us, we are going to take a few more questions and want to bring on the last guest because we have been talking about what you need to know now on the local level, on the state level, and on the national level. Now we're going to bring it all the way down to the local level in terms of what we're doing now to address our communities, to address some of the issues in the wake of what we've experienced as a result of the murder of George Floyd. This is specific to Charlotte City Council, but what we're going to talk about briefly is going to be really important all across the country, but also understand that we have a very unique form of governing Mecklenburg County, or specifically Charlotte, because we have a council manager system. And if you missed that on the last episode, we talked about that in a little bit more depth. But final guest before we move to the full panel for some of your questions is a very dear friend of mine. My line sister, if you will. I got to put that out there. And she is in her first term as a Charlotte City Councilwoman, strong ties to the community. But I wanted to have her on specifically because if you didn't catch the last episode where I had Councilman Mitchell and Senator Muhammad on it, he specifically talked about the work that she has done that has allowed us to really have those conversations, which will be in alignment with what you've already heard Dr. Sadler talk about, but really what we're doing on a local level. And having seen the minutes from the first meeting, it was very real, very raw, but she is really the brainchild in terms of how all of this came to be. So welcome to the show, the lovely Victoria Watlington. That will be Councilwoman Victoria Watlington. How are you doing, dear?
How you doing, Sarah?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. So welcome to the show. Welcome to the show. I know you had had another show earlier. So thank you for taking the time to join us, but I'm really honored to have you up here to really talk about what we're doing on the local level, because a lot of people just don't know. Like, people are frustrated. Why can't we do this? Why haven't we done that? But we actually are starting to have those conversations. Now, obviously, this being your first term, tell us a little bit about the journey. Why did you decide to get into politics? And that's the first question. And what's the biggest lesson you've learned since you joined City Council?
Sure. So that's a doozy. I'll try to keep it brief. I actually never had any intention at all of going into politics per se. My focus has always just been community service and how to solve problems, really. I'm an engineer by training, and so I'm always looking for how do we make sense out of the issue. If there's a problem, let's define it, and then let's start working on a solution. And so as I got involved with my neighborhood association, the more I dug, the more I found. And it started to become obvious to me that there was definitely a disparity just in terms of information. You talked about just a moment ago about some people just don't know. We're frustrated, but don't necessarily understand the system, the form of government, what are the buttons and the levers that can be pushed and pulled to get things done. And so from working with my neighborhood specifically and starting to get involved with some of the community academies that the city puts on, just learning more about how our government worked. For example, the City Planning Academy, which is where I would say I probably had my light bulb moment. We learned about the history of Charlotte and redlining and urban renewal and housing discrimination and how that shaped literally our city. We talk about the crescent and the wedge, and anybody who lives in Charlotte for any period of time understands that pretty much is how we are able to overlay any socioeconomic factor, and you can see that physical pattern in our city, the haves and the have-nots, if you will. And so it was in that academy that I said, well, wait a minute, if this was done by design, we've got to design our way out of it. And that was where I set my mind to learn as much as I could. And I just followed my passion. And then timing, is always a factor when it comes to politics. Our representative at the time was moving on to run for another seat. And so there was an opening, and the work that I had been doing as the land use committee chair for the West Boulevard Coalition was to a place where we had finished the playbook, our West Corridor playbook. And so my community leaders actually, I'll say, voluntold me that, okay, you've led it on the community side. Now we want to see you carry it through on the execution side from the dais. So that's how I ended up getting into politics. And to answer your second question, what have I learned so far? So much. I was very happy to have come in with a little bit of understanding of who the key players were and how things worked. That was invaluable to me coming on, because immediately after we got on, COVID, we had the RNC conversations, and it's just been one thing after another. Then the murder of George Floyd over the summer, or earlier in the summer, that then set off our own reckoning here in Charlotte. So it's been an interesting, challenging year. But if I had to sum up what I've learned, it's just to be able to adapt. You come in with a plan and with priorities, but you've got to be able to adapt to meet the moment and figure out how all of these things can work together to still deliver what you came for.
So let's talk about your brainchild then, because and I am giving the proper credit because he said it repeatedly. This was your brainchild. As far as the committee and the committee that has come together, I think the first meeting was a week or so ago, the 21st. I can't remember the date.
14th.
Yes. So tell folks who don't know what the committee is, how it was created, and what are the goals.
Sure. So this committee, we've got our council Safe Communities Committee, which is our standing committee that was commissioned by the mayor. There are 5 council members on that committee. It's council member Larkin Eggleston, who's the chair, council member James Mitchell, who's the vice chair, and then myself, council members Renee Johnson and Dimple Ajmira. And so we are the body that was charged at the beginning of the year with working with the county and other government entities with addressing violence reduction. Everyone knows last year we had a record number of homicides in the city of Charlotte. And so we really began the year with wanting to approach violent crime as a public health issue. Then when COVID came, we had another public health issue, and we, as you all know, have been focused on our COVID response. And so as we come back to not only violent crime, but also police reform, because it has layers to it, and there are so many overlapping things in those two issues. But we've got the council committee who is meeting every 2 weeks, and then we've got our citizens interest group, one of who the members are is Vicki Foster, who just mentioned that she served on the committee, and they meet every other week in preparation for our meetings. And so the idea is that we can hear from a cross section of experts, community leaders, justice adjacent individuals that can tell us what the community is saying, that can bring their ideas, their expertise, their experience to the issues. So we kicked it off with youth programs and CMPD's youth engagement activities, because we know that in the summertime, particularly with everyone out of school, and with COVID, there not being a lot of options from a youth engagement standpoint, that we tend to see a rise in crime. And we also know that the demographic that we see that tend to be perpetrators of the crime are young Black males, late teens, early 20s. And so we wanted to rally the troops around that initially, in an effort to curb what we are seeing in terms of a rise in violent crime. But that's the first one. What I did is I went through the police directives, and there are, I'll say, 8 series, if you will, of directives, and each of them cover different things, from the role of the police officer to youth engagement to video recordings to chain of custody, all of the things that govern the SOPs, or the standing operating procedures for police officers, start with these policies. And so I went through each one, and I went back and read through all of the feedback from the community from 2008, from 2016, from the Civil Service Board's annual reports each year, to see what themes that we were seeing that people were saying we needed to address. And then I pulled out the policies that are associated with those things. And so we laid it out over, or I laid it out over the course of 16 to 18 weeks. And so we'll be tackling each one in each one of our sessions. And so we'll keep marching through October. Now, that is one specific work stream. That's police reform. Outside of that is the violence reduction piece. And we're just starting to wrap our heads around how we want to approach that. But each committee will have their own focus area that supports violence reduction. For instance, in our last meeting in Safe Communities, we actually referred a independent audit for CMPD's budget over to the budget committee. So that's how they'll be supporting. From an economic development standpoint, we know that oftentimes returning citizens and justice involved folks have trouble being able to re-enter the workforce, and then they, left with few options, end up back in situations that lead them back into the criminal justice system. And so a huge piece of that is workforce development. And so we've kicked off some work in the ED committee under Councilmember Mitchell with that. But that's the thinking right now. But we've only begun the work, but I think we've got the buy-in that we need to continue asking the tough questions and seeing how not only are we asking tough questions, but really developing solutions. In our first meeting, we were able to move to refer to the full council an adjustment in the police budget to increase funding for youth programs specifically, as a result of what we learned. And also we'll be looking in our next meeting in August to follow up on that initial subject, because we want to make sure that we're putting the resources in the right specific areas in the zip codes where we know that we've got youth that are more likely to be justice involved.
Okay. And so getting some feedback. So what I think one of the things is that, as I bring everybody on in just a second, that we really need to take a close look at, if we're going to talk about police reform as it relates to the criminal justice system, what does that mean in terms of putting some teeth behind 8 can't wait? Because we all had talked about that on the last show, and the concern was, okay, we have these initiatives, but now what? And to get beyond things that the public may perceive as just something on paper versus putting some teeth behind it. So I'm gonna bring Rob, Dr. Sadler, Miss Foster, Miss Little. All right. So we have a couple of quick questions that I want to cover. One of the questions, and I think this is more so for you, Vicki, is what should we as a public expect from our new chief? What should we expect from him in terms of a commitment to the community that means something?
Well,
We just gonna go hard in the paint out the gate. That's what should we expect?
well, I mean, obviously, I can't speak for what and how he plans to pull the community and police back together. I don't know his strategy, but I can tell you just from knowing him personally that he is one of those people that is willing to listen. He's one of those people that you can bring ideas to. And I think that he'll spend a lot of time meeting with individuals. I think he'll spend a lot of time meeting with groups. And I think that you'll see him moving around trying to hear really what people want to happen and how they want to be involved. And I think he'll try to figure out how to engage the community more in what the police does.
And so, Victoria, we all know that there was a proclamation done that declared racism as a public health issue. But so what?
Right.
Like, so we declared it, it's on paper. We've already talked about bias issues. Dr. Sadler already spoke about how race impacts everything from housing to jobs to all of that. We have a proclamation, but so now what do we do? So what?
Sure. So I think it definitely has to transition into the things that racism has caused, right? When you start to look socioeconomically, those are really, to me, where the rubber meets the road. And so if we say racism is a public health issue, how has it impacted the lives of our communities of color? And so that's where you start to have to understand it from an education standpoint, from a job standpoint, from a housing standpoint, from a criminal justice system standpoint. And I think that we have to look at it holistically, because too often I think that we burden one component or one organization with answering all the questions, and it really is multifaceted. And so when I think about the Criminal Justice Advisory Group that was commissioned, I believe earlier this year or late last year, where it's got city resources, it's got county resources, it's got district attorney resources, all of the CM or the police chiefs from each town sit on this advisory group. We've really, really got to leverage that group as the place where we're putting together our master plan, where we understand how we can work together to really deliver solutions that are holistic, and so that it's not handoff. So we talk about policing in our neighborhoods and why it is that when someone is arrested, they can be back on the block within 2 hours. Well, that is an issue that we've got to work together with our district attorney's office to work on, right? And so I think that as we talk about it being a public health issue, we've got to grab the data. We've got to roll our sleeves up and get real clear about where specifically are we going to be able to make the most impact. We've highlighted 5 areas of opportunity. The first 2 that we're going to focus on being Beatty Sport Road and then also West Boulevard. And so those are places that we've got to look and say, okay, how are we trending in education? How are we trending in economics? How are we trending in housing? And what can we do programmatically right now that can address those things?
Well, to Dr. Sadler's point, though, I think some of the concerns that people have, and I don't know what the solution is. I really don't. But we've done all these wonderful studies. We've done economic opportunity studies, and like you said, it just gets kind of put on the shelf. We like have this big press conference with an announcement. Here's our findings. Okay. Now what are we going to do about it? Because we haven't gone up. Like we're still 50 out of 50. Nothing's changed. And I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I totally agree with you. And I think it's that innovation piece. One thing that I've learned during this first year in my term is that government, there is a different incentive in the private sector to innovate. You have to innovate to stay alive. Whereas with government, it's really about controlling and maintaining, right? You want to create a sense of stability. And so I think that the skill set that is needed to do things differently is really to be able to dig in and be willing to go to the neighborhoods, be willing to pick up the phone and call developers, be willing to pick up the phone and call clergymen. And really, it's about working deals, truly. When you talk about violent crime, you got to, and where it occurs, for instance, with businesses, you got to pick up the phone and call those property owners. You got to pick up the phone and engage with the development community. You got to talk to lending institutions. What are people willing to invest here to do something different? But it starts with that ownership. If you don't own the land, you don't own the buildings, well, then it's a different conversation.
Okay.
conversation. And so I think that you have a cross-functional approach to it. You got to understand the economics of it. You got to understand the relationships of it. You got to learn how to mobilize, and you got to be able to envision what the solutions could look like and understand that there are no silver bullets. So that's what I see that is distinctly different in government versus the private sector,
So
if that makes sense.
gotcha. And I'm gonna let a couple of you all chime in, but just for informational purposes, someone wants to speak at city council since we don't have live meetings. How do they go about doing that? I understand they have to contact the clerk. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. You just go straight to the city. You can even just Google City of Charlotte City Clerk, and there are tabs at the top that you'll follow, and it'll take you right to signing up to speak.
And for people who don't know, how often does city council meet?
We meet once a week on Mondays, except for the fifth Monday of the month. So we won't be meeting next week.
At what time?
We start generally at 5 o'clock. Sometimes we'll start earlier at 4 for like zoning meetings or if there's a full agenda, but it's generally 5 o'clock. But you can also see at the city clerk's website the upcoming meetings, what's going to be on the agenda, and what time we plan to start. And you'll see those meetings at least 48 hours in advance if they are emergency meetings or things that are not on our regular calendar. But our full calendar is available to see for the whole year.
Okay, so as we wrap up, I want to ask you each individually this question. So, and I wanted to focus on it from the perspective of now, what do we do as we are approaching November? Now, what do we do as we are, taking this energy of what has happened in wake of George Floyd's murder? How do we harness that energy so that this movement doesn't just fade like others have in the past? Before I say that, though, one thing that Renee and I talked about, but again, so incredibly important as we prepare for November, is that you have to make sure that you are registered. One thing that Renee said that was super critical is somebody has been convicted of a felony, but they have served their sentence and they're no longer on probation. Their rights are automatically restored, but they may have to register. So that's information that we have to get out across all communities. People assume, I'm a felon, I can't vote. Not necessarily true. As she also pointed out, particularly on the federal side, you have to just simply go to the clerk's office to make sure that you get your rights restored that way. But people don't know that. So we have to make sure that we get that information out there, and we'll do that periodically. And also we have so much at stake. Obviously, Judge Little, I just love saying that. I'm going to still enjoy saying that. But you're going to have to recuse yourself from all my cases, right? Like, I ain't even going to be able to appear in front of you.
Absolutely, Judge Trotman.
Dang.
You're my mentor. You're my mentor. So you can't come to my court.
I love to say it, though.
You can't come to my court.
I come in and say, hey, girl. Well, not maybe that. Maybe not that. But I give you the, hey, and then I run out the room.
Thank you, Judge.
But in all seriousness, what would you say, Renee, that is so important for people to know now? What can they do now to be able to harness some of this momentum? And what is it that you think we all have a responsibility to do when we start thinking about race and implicit bias?
Three things. Know that you can work from where you are. You don't have to be an elected official. You don't have to have this amazing podcast like Yolanda Trotman does. You can start from where you are to educate yourself about the history of Black people and people in this country. It's been interesting seeing Hamilton come out and people kind of reimagining history, but people of color have not been written into history, right? It's been reimagined. So people who are allies that are not Black really need to be open to learning new history. And being open to listen to people of color, listen to the stories of pain, let people cry, let people express themselves in the way they need to. And people of color have to educate themselves to know how to not just call out, but call people in. We need allies in this work. You're not going to move the needle. The racial reconciliation that Dr. Sadler talks about, that takes all God's children. And so we really need the art of listening, knowing our history, and being able to educate ourselves about implicit bias and the ways to mitigate it so that you can really start to move the needle. And finally, understand this, y'all, we're building cathedrals, as the Honorable Elisa Chin-Gary says. This may last beyond our lifetime. It's not a quick fix. Race is part of the problem. It's going to have to be a part of the solution, but it takes patience, it takes some hope, and a whole lot of love. So listen, love, start where you are.
Amen.
Powerful. Dr. Sadler, what would you say? Well, and then actually the question I think people may have, somebody had texted me, wanted to know if is there a meeting set up for the first open session for the community yet? And if not, when can we, or how can we find out more information? And then of course the same question, what do you think people need to know now?
Yeah. So we've talked about several different dates for the first meeting. I think we're going to try to push it back to the beginning of September, just because of August being a time when a lot of people are off, and just trying to get this together. We want the first hearing of the panel to be something that's significant, that can demonstrate how this can work in Charlotte. So that's underway. The larger question that you asked is one that I really want to focus on. How can we begin to move wherever you are? If you are a member of a church, a mosque, a synagogue, how do you begin to coordinate people to work on these issues within your church? Begin to have listening sessions within your church, book readings within your church, bringing people to teach in your church. If you are your mosque or synagogue, or wherever you are, if you are a part of city council, if you're a part of the judicial system, how do you begin to examine what's going on in your own system? Everybody has a role to play, as Judge Little just said. Everybody has a role to play in this larger work, and we all have to be involved in making sure that this does move on. So my thing is, let's get involved. Let's do whatever we can right now. A friend of mine, Ellen Thatcher, has started a program on Facebook that's called Educating White People. She's a white woman who's trying to teach other white people what the issues of race are in America. So start where you are, do whatever you can, but realize you have a role to play in this larger work.
Excellent. Vicki Foster, what say you? What do you think people need to know now? And if they are interested in pushing for change in their local communities, as far as dealing with use of force policies, or whatever it may be, how can people start to make change as far as that's concerned? And what do you think people need to know now as well?
So I think one thing is really important for people to know, and I've said this before, is that those policies are made by chiefs of police. So obviously I'm talking about Charlotte, but that's in all of the police departments. So policies are made by the chief of police, and they can also be changed by the chief of police. And so it's important for citizens to know that if there's a policy or something that you don't agree with, then you have the ability to go talk to that chief of police. You have the ability to request a meeting. You can talk about what you want to know, how does it work, why does it work this way, and you can make recommendations. And so people have to realize that they're not powerless when it comes to police departments. You just have to know who to go to. So knowing that a police chief has all power in their hands to change policies such as use of force, that is a very simple fix, because they serve the people and we are the people. And so we have to come together in situations like that and come together comprehensively and talk about what change we want to see. And then you meet with the chief and you request those changes. Now, I'm not going to tell you that everything you request is going to be changed, because obviously that won't happen. But if it makes sense, then I can tell you that it would happen. So that's one thing that I want everybody to know, is that you all have the ability to do that. And that's with any police agency. So just know that policies are there for the protection of officers, but also for the protection of the community. And so the community has to be a part of making those changes and making those requests.
And so if they can't get a call back or a meeting with the chief or whatever, or whomever, what would you suggest if they can't have that conversation directly, or if they have trouble being able to have that conversation?
Well, let me say this. He's a new chief, so I'm not gonna do him like this, because I'd be like, put him on blast. But the reality of it is,
you kind of just did. But okay, go ahead.
Saying, here's the reality of it. Obviously the chief of police does not have time to meet with every single individual within this county that has a question or a comment about a policy. That's why you come together as groups. You go to groups, you go to different groups, you go to churches, you talk about it at your church, you come together as a unified front, because he cannot meet with each individual. And you look at things like the Safe Communities Committee, and you say, okay, you make recommendations, you find out who's on that committee, and you say, here's recommendations I have. So part of our problem is that we don't really come come together and we don't find out who we need to connect to make those things happen. You have council people. It's very simple. I mean, you all come together and say, hey, here's a recommendation that we have. So the individual thing doesn't work quite as well because people don't have time to deal with individuals. But you get together as groups, as community leaders, as church leaders, and that's where you start to make change. And then the chief can make time to meet with a group of people. So we just have to know that because a lot of times we're very individualized, and that's where you get shut down.
Absolutely. Good advice. Rob, what say you, sir? Because Victoria, I'm going to let you have the last word as we wrap up. Rob, what do you think? And I actually want you to take it from a different perspective. Just what people need to know in general, we could talk about it all night. We don't have all night, but just little things that people just don't know just when interacting with the system, just in general, if they find themselves or one of their loved ones involved in the system, like what do they need to know now?
Okay. Well, rule number one in terms of what you need to know if anyone gets caught up inadvertently in the system, and that is not to make a statement to anyone. So every opportunity,
oh my God,
you need to share.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. I had a moment. Go ahead.
Until your lawyer has a chance to talk to you. Along with that, and this is what the Honorable Renee Little has said multiple times, and that is the importance of jury duty, jury service. When if people have concerns about if people are being treated fairly when they go to court, and these are, difficult times, obviously, and people may not want to be in the building, but when things go back to some sense or normality, and we're starting doing jury trials again, if you are called, then try to serve. And if you can, but don't make it or try to get out of jury service. Another thing I think is important for people to know, and is that our court system is not a revolving door. People don't come in and go right back out, especially for serious crimes. And I know people think that in other counties, and I've had DAs say, this isn't Mecklenburg, we do things differently. But you don't come in and you go right back out. You got people there who stay there for 1-2+ years before they even get to a trial. So that's why, people take the opportunity to talk to those stakeholders. There are things that are being done now that are, I think, more equitable in terms of Ms. Trotman and I are in court, and the DA was making concessions in terms of with bond and agreeing for people to be released on unsecured bonds, because the DAs will not be able or are not able to send those cases to the grand jury. And there's no reason for someone to languish in jail when they don't even know what they're going to do with the case. And they are, when we say in terms of doing things, we're saying you're doing things differently now. These are things that they should be doing by law. In terms of the law states, you need to consider all of these factors when setting a bond or setting conditions of release. So if people are being more compassionate now, they need to be doing that as we move forward. But yeah, just a couple of things.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And Councilwoman Watlington, what say you?
Well, Vic Foster said a mouthful. She really did. You hit the nail on the head. When it comes to getting involved, go find your tribe, because I guarantee you that somebody else has already started the process and got the ball rolling. So it is fantastic for people to be passionate about things, but also understand that there's power in a group and there's learning there. And so take your ideas, take your passions to the community organizations that are working on these kinds of things, and we're stronger together. The other thing that I will say is keep that same energy that you had at the ballot box. Stay involved and stay informed. You don't have to know every single thing, but pick something that you're passionate about, because I tell you that the more informed and educated you are about the system, the more seriously people are going to take you. And that's how you get things done.
Absolutely. So with that, well, first of all, I want to thank each of you for taking your time out tonight to have this wrap up session. And it's so important for those of you who are just joining us, or you caught us midway through. The replay will be available shortly. So make a point of sharing the replay, setting it up as a watch party so that people can see what they may have missed if they were just able to jump on and jump off, because there's so much information. I do want to focus on a couple of things real quick that we did talk about earlier. One of the biggest things, obviously, is that it is so important that you make sure that you go ahead and check your registration, that you can vote through the DMV website at ncdot.gov. At I Will Vote, you can check your registration status. If you need to make any changes, it'll take you to the Board of Elections website, especially as far as if there have been any address changes, you can register there. One thing I also wanted to point out too, which is also very important, if you are interested in being a poll worker, cannot stress how important it is. And the Board of Elections has talked about this as well. If you go to the Board of Elections website, which is ncbe.gov, B-O,
BOE.
so
McBoe.
well, you can go. Why don't you do this? Go to MECBO, MCKBOE.org. That will take you to the State Board of Elections website. There's a specific link where you can go to volunteer. Cannot stress this enough, because poll workers are going to be needed. They tend to be people who are retired. We're going to need younger poll workers. No disrespect to people who've been poll workers in the past, but this election is too important for precincts to be shut down because poll workers get sick or there's a COVID outbreak. We cannot take any of that for granted. So if you go to the if you go to the State Board of Elections website, and this is across any state, because I went to check, that's where you can sign up to volunteer. That's done through the Board of Elections, because we're going to make sure that we need poll workers. You can also go ahead now actually and request your absentee ballot for that to be sent to you just in case. I know, like most of us, probably all 6 of us on this panel will be in a hazmat suit if we have to during early voting. Because
Yes.
right, I know I am. I can tape something around my. It's fine. We're gonna work it out. But I mean, it's just that important, because we all know how important this election is. We don't even need to go into all of that. But to know that you're registered, to know that if you have friends who have had felonies, that their rights are restored if they're no longer on probation and finish their sentence, to know that all they need to do is to go and register. They're not locked out of the process. They just have to know the information that they need to know. So
Absolutely.
as far as what people need to know now on the state, local, and national level, so much has been covered. But I just kind of want to touch base on what each of you all said. I think, Renee, you said it best. Start where you are. Listen, love, as far as understanding your own biases. Cannot stress enough, again, to go to implicit.harvard.edu to take the test. I think Maurice asked me if there was a cheat code. There's not a cheat code, sir. If you try to cheat it, your results are going to upset you. Trust me. I tried to beat it. You can't beat it. So just take the test. It's going to be fine. But I make light of that. But this is so incredibly important, especially as Black folks, because we don't assume that we have bias because of the issues we've had to deal with race, and we absolutely do. And if we don't check ourselves, we can't have those meaningful conversations as we begin to talk about race. Certainly, as Dr. Sattler said, use your church, use opportunities to learn. And I think this really comes to what Vicki talked about as far as the power in groups, the power of a group of church members, or the power of a group of clergy, or the power of groups in general that can talk to the Victoria Watlingtons on city council, or talk to people on county commission in such a way that is meaningful, that we can start to make change. Now, obviously, the work that Councilwoman Watlington has done will take time, but obviously we also have city council meetings that happen every week that you can sign up through the clerk to be heard. But Smudgy also, Councilman Mitchell also told us how you can actually go back and see voting records of council members, because that becomes a public record. Even if something's done in closed session, eventually it becomes public record. To know how your council men and women are voting, because just because they happen to be of a particular party, they may not be representing your interest. Let me say that again. Just because they may be of a particular party, I know I'm about to start something, but just because they have a D, they're Democrats, that does not necessarily mean they represent your interest. And this is going to be particularly important with city council, because that's what controls the budget for CMPD. That's the organization that can give subpoena power to the Civilian Review Board. That's where all of the things that we're talking about we want to change. And if that council person is not voting consistent with your interest, whether that person is at large or in their district, this is what we need to pay attention to, because it's not enough just to get the person in the office. It's also important that you hold people accountable. You can't do that if you don't know how they vote. Same thing on the state level as far as state legislators, state senators, who's showing up, who's missing their votes, who's actually present, who's actually putting in the work. I'm about to go on a tangent. So anyway, but as Rob said, jury service is incredibly important. Shut your mouth when they come to talk to you. If you get arrested, no disrespect, Vicky, shut your mouth. Just don't say anything. You're not going to out-talk the police. You're not going to be smarter than them. They can say things that aren't true. And then if you've seen enough of the first 48, it never goes well. Just shut your mouth. Just shut your mouth. Ask for a lawyer. Say, I want a lawyer, and then be quiet. Because I kind of talked about this before, but seriously, like Rob and I are not kidding. Shut your mouth. But we also need, it's so important that people don't get out of jury service, that they don't try to get out of jury service, especially when we're kind of navigating this jury process. Hopefully we'll be starting soon, but now we're talking about the possibility or the probability of face mask and how to navigate that. So it is so important. And I think, as Councilwoman Victoria Watlington said, keep that same energy. Whatever you've been passionate about this time, keep that same energy. Don't let it die. Don't allow it to become complacent. Don't allow yourself to become complacent, as we're in this age of staying at home and relaxing and chilling, if you will. But we can't allow ourselves to become complacent, because we have too much on the line that's coming up on November the 3rd. Victoria, do you happen to know when early voting starts? Because I don't remember offhand.
I don't have it offhand.
Anybody know offhand?
I think it's October 27th.
It's generally 3 weeks before.
Yeah, I think it's somewhere around October 27th.
Okay. So early voting, we strongly encourage you to early vote. Oftentimes, most of our local races really are decided at the early voting stage, unless they are very tight and they're close. Thank you so much, Renee Little, former judge, or future judge rather, Renee Little. I just can't wait to roll up in your courtroom.
Thank you.
Hey, girl.
And Yolanda, thank you for this entire series. I mean, it's been phenomenal. We want to really just honor you. It's been phenomenal. Please, everyone, go back to YouTube, watch the whole thing. What Assistant Chief retired now, but her session, Chief Justice's session, Smudgy I mean, it's been phenomenal. Everything in this indictment series. So please, kudos to you for what you're doing in this community.
Thank you, my dear. So with that,
thank you very much.
Thank you all for joining us. Now, Dr. Sadler, definitely will have you back on as we get closer to that first session in September, because we want to make sure people are very clear on the objectives and that we have as much public turnout as possible, so that we're having those real conversations on truth and reconciliation, because we're modeling this after what needed to happen once apartheid ended in South Africa, and that whole process. So we're modeling it after that, ultimately to become a national model. Rob Corbett is in private practice of the Corbett Law Firm, very dynamic defense attorney here in Charlotte. Tell us your number in case people need to reach you.
Well, if you can't reach Ms. Trotman, then you can reach me at 704-401-5299. If you cannot reach Ms. Trotman, I'll defer to her.
Well, that will be 980-785-1123. If not, then give Rob a call. But having seen him do his thing and work with him for years, he is fantastic, especially on the federal level. Just absolutely fantastic. Councilwoman Watlington, how can they get in touch? I know email's the fastest, but what's the email address? I'm going to drop that in the comments when we're done as well. Victoria.watlington@charlottenc.gov. That's VICTORIA.WATLINGTON@charlottenc.gov. Okay. And Dr. Sadler, I know there's not a website up yet. Is there an email address where people can reach out to you? I'll drop that in the comments when we're done as well.
We're working on the website now. Hopefully it will be up in the next couple of weeks, but RSADLER, R Sadler at U as in Union, P as in Presbyterian, S as in Seminary, E as in Edward, M as in Mike, .edu. Sadler at upsem.edu.
Okay, and they can reach out to you if they have questions or want to know more about the project. And Vicki, how can people get in touch with you if they have questions in terms of how they can navigate this space as far as addressing police reform?
Oh, you would get me at the end, because I was like, they can't.
Yes, they can.
I was like, oh, she got me at the end.
Hey, you see my face?
Reform. Okay.
Yes, they can.
My email is Vicky Motivates, VICKIMOTIVATES @gmail.com. Vicky
Okay.
Motivates @gmail.com. VICK.
All right, so I'm gonna drop all that in the comments, and it'll also be in the recap. So I know you can't escape this, Vicky. You cannot escape, ma'am. And finally, future Judge Little, how can we get into Judge? I can't really call you technically Judge Elect. Future Judge Little. Future
Judge.
Judge.
All right.
Let me
We
say, I
declare and
say it now.
decree it, right? We will declare and decree until it is.
Amen and amen.
Please visit my website at www.crenee4judge.com. You can also email me at little4judge at gmail.com. And please be happy to talk with anybody about what RMJJ is doing, what I am hoping to do as your next district court judge, and really how people can start to learn more about this entire process.
Outstanding. And what's the RMJJ website?
www.rmjj.org.
Perfect. All right. Thank you all so much. Thank you for those of you who were tuning in, or if you're tuning in to the replay, we can still take your questions. And of course, if you have not already done so, like, follow, and subscribe at all things at the Combo Pod Show. Going on hiatus for the month of August. It's probably not going to be true because something's going to happen and we're going to have to talk about it. But that's the plan. Now, I will say that we're resuming some of the studio shows. So 2 of the studio shows that we had recorded pre-COVID will be released in August. And then as we prepare for our next, there's 2 series that we're kicking off in September, but I suspect with everything going on with the schools and, shifts, that we'll probably have at least 1 episode sometime in August, but everybody else get a hiatus. I'm going on hiatus. So there's that.
Early happy birthday, Judge. Early happy birthday. Her birthday month's coming up. So early happy birthday.
It's Leo season.
Leo
For those
season.
of you who are watching, official birthday is on Monday. Happy 46 chapter is about to open, and there we go. So thank you guys so much for everything, for tuning in. For those of you who are watching or catching the replay, thank you so much, Renee, Victoria, Vicky, Rob, Rodney. I really, really appreciate all the wonderful information that you've given us. And this will be the first of many conversations, and we will talk to you all soon. Everybody have a good night.
Thank you so much.
Good night. Vote.
Yes.
Yes.